We're live.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. It is such a treat and an honor to have Jonathan Lethem here at the bookstore for the first time in ever. And we've been trying to get him here for, boy, I remember was it 1994 that your first book, Gun with Occasional Music, came out?
Right. Yeah.
And, it just kind of blew everybody away. This wonderful hybrid of kind of pulp fiction and speculative fiction, Philip K. Dick kind of thing. And I've been trying to get him here ever since. And Motherless Brooklyn came out, when was that released? 99. And now here we are with this brilliant and very, very timely book, The Feral Detective. And we'll talk about that and Philip K. Dick and all sorts of things. First of all, let's can I ask you a little bit about Motherless Brooklyn, since you've never been here before?
Yeah.
Now I've heard some stories in the press about kind of some tragic events that have happened on this film set.
Oh well, yeah. I wasn't in New York when it went down, but there was a fire. Yeah. And in a building that they were shooting in one space, and then there was a fire in the upstairs, which was a residential area, and in the process of clearing it, one of the firefighters was killed.
Oh man!
So it sort of got dubbed the Motherless Brooklyn Fire by the tabloids in New York, but I guess I don't know a whole lot about it. I guess the film crew and the investigators are on the same page that it was not a film set fire per se. It was a fire in this building that they were working at the same time. But it was sad.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant cast from what I understand. Edward Norton directing and starring in it.
It's a huge number of interesting
Dafoe.
people. Yeah, Alec Baldwin and Cherry Jones, Michael K. Williams, the guy who played Omar in The Wire.
Right.
I think his part, he's playing a kind of jazz musician who's loosely modeled on like Miles Davis.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Does he have the rough voice and everything?
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, I remember reading when Motherless Brooklyn came out. Has everybody read that book? What a wonderful book. Your inspiration for it. I remember reading that you saw an episode of Frontline. Was that the right show, or it's been so long ago?
Yeah, no. I the first thing I saw that got me focused on Tourette syndrome was I'd read about it in Oliver Sacks. He has 2 essays.
Okay.
One in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and another one in Anthropologist on Mars. And then just after discovering it in the Sacks essays, I saw a documentary called Twitch and Shout.
That's what I was thinking.
Which was in the movie theater when I saw it. It was actually Guerrero in San Francisco that I saw. What was the name of that theater? I want to say the Roxy. Yeah, it was right where you were talking about getting a burrito.
Oh right, yeah.
I mean, like a couple of doors down. But maybe they did show it as well on the front line, so that's what you're thinking of. It would make sense for that to have been screened on PBS. But it was after reading those essays by Sacks and seeing that documentary that I suddenly was consumed with interest in Tourette's and felt almost instantly that I was going to have to write about it. That it was felt relevant to me in a way that I couldn't pin down. Eventually I came to the feeling that I identified with it in a way, that there was a part of me, my neurological style that I was recognizing, even if I don't have anything that anyone would diagnose with Tourette's. But that even just my habits with language, that the way I used language when I was writing, seemed to me to already be kind of in a certain way in that ballpark. This kind of compulsive reversals or repetitions.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. Some of the people here at the staff say I have a mild case of Tourette's. I suppose I probably do. But, I had some preconceived ideas of what I thought Tourette's was. And reading your book really kind of educated me in a way, because I think when we think of Tourette's, we think of someone just screaming profanity, and in fact, that's not really
Yeah,
what
it's,
it
it's
is.
a very flamboyant symptom that people focus on, but I think it's a minority of sufferers who have that fate, that challenge. And anyway, even for those who do that sometimes or a lot, it's usually part of a constellation of other things. And a lot of the tics are not verbal but physical. It's very common to have, whether it's like a winking or some kind of repetitive head motion or the need to, as I gave to Lionel in the book, the need to touch things a lot and kind of move things around.
Right, and then the word association, just this endless unraveling of associated words. It's just a magical thing. Really enjoyed it. Let's talk a little bit about the new book. Can you tell us kind of? I know that you've been a New Yorker for a long time, and recently you're living out in this part of the world, in Pomona, Claremont. And as I said earlier, it's very much a novel about today in a way. This sort of return to tribalism. Can you talk about kind of what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a few different things that began to creep up on me and make me feel that I had a book I wanted to write that predated the current events that I ended up using. I was getting interested in the desert, living in Claremont, which is, it's the easternmost town in Los Angeles County. The next thing over, which I can just walk to, is San Bernardino County. And when you first lay eyes on that landscape, what's called the Inland Empire, it can seem like this very undifferentiated, endless sprawl of suburbs. But being there for a while, you begin to pick out differences and ways in which the landscape's changing, or something is giving way to something else. And I began to realize I sort of lived at the very edge of the desert lands, that just across the way, in a sense, was the western edge of, it was the doorway to Joshua Tree and the Mojave, and that was its own really weird and interesting zone, and I started to travel into it and sometimes find friends with Jeeps and go off-road a little bit, and it has this, well, it's, in a sense, it's a place where the fantasies about American freedom, the frontier fantasies, can still be played out, maybe in a minor key, but it's just so unboundaried, and so it's both like a left and a right fantasy. You can be a libertarian, or you can be an anarchist. You can do pretty much anything out there and not be have anyone brush up against you or object. It's a good place to build sculptures or cook meth or make sculptures out of meth, whatever you want to do.
That whole kind of region, from the Mexican border, actually all the way up through like Palmdale and that whole area.
Yeah.
The Salton Sea.
The Salton Sea. I was thinking of Slab City as well.
Yeah.
With my strange characters living out their kind of edge existence. And so I just was thinking also about the coming eco-catastrophe and various responses to that, rational and irrational ones, having to do with wanting to get off the grid somehow or into some kind of self-sufficient preserve out in the landscape somewhere. And so all of that stuff was percolating around. My interest in the environment. I'd already lived in California once before, in Northern California, and I'd traveled in the desert and even written about it in some ways before, in Amnesia Moon and Girl in Landscape. But there's something about this present life located in the Inland Empire where I started to really ground myself in the reality of it a little more, the texture of, and the Mojave specifically, the way people were using that space. So I started to think about a story about this kind of Slab City, off the grid, communal, alternative idea of living, a sort of escape from the system of binaries, somewhere that wasn't red or blue, that wasn't exactly east or west, or coastal elite or flyover country, but was like some other space that you could get into to get off of that oppressive machine of dualities. and I started also to want to write about, or rather, to use the hard-boiled style again. That came partly because I was asked to write the introduction to the annotated Big Sleep that came out.
Yeah.
And it got me reading Chandler again, and that led me to read Ross MacDonald again. And unlike the first time that I'd read those guys, when all of the information I had about Southern California basically was coming from their pages, now I was seeing their use of that landscape. And MacDonald in particular was very scrupulous about writing about different parts of the region. I was seeing it through my own experience of being placed, in these environments. So it made me think that it was a really good method for talking about this space I'd come to, that it would work. And also I just was pining for that style.
Right.
It was time again.
Well, that annotated Big Sleep, I read that too, and I think they did a really fantastic job with it. Kind of approaching it from a multidisciplinary perspective.
Yeah.
And what you don't read about a lot. L.A. and California is such a fascinating history in the 20th century, in particular. This sort of boom and bust economy, the way it goes, and when Kane and Chandler and those guys were writing, I'm thinking of Mildred Pierce, for some reason. In the background, you have this, this rash of suicides, this kind of sense of the American dream kind of crumbling in depression.
Yeah, this is in Nathaniel West, Daniel Locust too. I think that, in the American mythic scheme, California and LA, maybe specifically the Southlands in particular, are this endpoint for the psychic push to create, a new reality. Like, what do we do with this freedom? Well, we keep spreading it out west until we bump into the ocean, and then we have to set up a society there that's sort of going to exemplify this freedom that we've claimed for ourselves, all these principles and all these appetites for reinvention and to become, to start history over again outside of the old, hierarchies or whatever. And it is very far from Europe and from the eastern enclaves like New York and Boston. So, so then it becomes a question of so what did you do with that? Did you make a utopia or did it turn into dystopia? What happened? And of course, one part of the answer is that lots of old hangovers of all sorts of historical crimes or oppressions or hierarchies did come along with us after all. In the vacuum, people are insecure and also follow gurus or cults very rapidly. You get Amos Sample McPherson and all sorts of Jim Jones and all sorts of other propositional little kind of tin dictators spring up very naturally in that environment. Charles Manson too, and but also you get this kind of continuing. It's not a settled thing. I think it's a continuing attempt to prove that freedom and wide open space can amount to something utopian, and dystopia is always a possibility stalking it in various ways.
Right.
So that's a kind of it's not just a done deal. I think it's a ongoing tension, and that's the scene that you feel being written about in the I think in the atmosphere of the curdled utopia that Chandler or Nathaniel West are writing.
I'm sure you have. Have you read those wonderful short novels by Horace McCoy?
Yes, I love those as well. Yeah.
They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And the Hollywood novels that he did.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the title.
There was one that has a wonderful title. It was I Should Have Stayed Home.
I Should Have Stayed Home, right. Yeah.
And there was another one I'm forgetting the name of. Great Hollywood novel. But it's funny, when I was reading this book, maybe you could talk a little bit more about kind of the setup. It's very, very much a classic detective setup in a way. The girl kind of gone missing into this environment. But I couldn't help thinking of Herbert Asbury. I don't know why.
Oh, that's interesting. Wouldn't have crossed my mind. I think I've only read one or I think just one.
I'm just thinking of the Gangs of New York.
Gangs of New York when I was a kid.
The Rabbits and.
But of course you're right. There is a gang called the Rabbits. Yeah. Well, no, I was thinking. So I set up these two sort of.
We don't want to give too much away, but.
Tribal you know, it's basically a broken commune. They were all one people, and then the fisher developed, and some of them declared themselves the rabbits, and others became the bears. And it's like a male-female breakdown, but it's also about nomadic versus, you know, homesteading impulses, and you know, in that sense, there's the form and the voice of a hard-boiled detective story, but this is also a book that's a kind of a Western,
Right.
A contemporary Western. And it's about, you know, just as you would encounter in a lot of the John Ford films, the tension between the people who are trying to civilize, quote unquote, the space, and others, you know, maybe the ranchers who want to keep it, you know, who fight statehood, the kind of people who are fighting statehood in the, you know, in the backdrop of the Manishal Liberty Valance, the ones who hire Liberty Valance to screw up the election and stuff. And the Rabbits and Bears are also a kind of a vision of the broken counterculture, you know, the failure of the 60s generation to do something completely new and successful with gender relations, you know, as many other kinds of ideal utopian or Aquarian ideals they espoused. There was often, you know, this kind of, the men still, you know, brought the laundry to the women for, you know, for them to wash and stuff,
Right.
and you know, didn't change the diapers. And I mean, I'm being a little silly, but actually there was a famous commune, the Black Bear Ranch, that did have a breakdown that was sort of along gender lines, and that fascinated me. And it actually was written about in another novel by Richard Bronigan. He kind of allegorized the Black Bear Ranch disaster in a book called In Watermelon Sugar.
Wow.
So I wrote a more literal version of a kind of a, you know, 60s legacy utopian experiment going bad in this book.
So the character Phoebe, the lead character, she one of her friend's daughters really has gone missing. And can you talk a little bit about the basic setup for the book?
Yeah, well, so I grew up in New York, and I've been living in this space, Inland Empire, edge of the desert, as I was describing it, for a while, but it's still perplexing to me and opaque in a lot of ways. And so one of the simplest things you can do as a writer is just have a character who's even more stupefied or ill-informed than you are to be your proxy, so that your own wondering about a thing can just be represented on the page. So I picked a New Yorker to invade this space, you know, which is also, again, kind of like a classical Western motif. It's like Jimmy Stewart coming east from Boston in the Manishal Liberty Valance. There's always a moment in the Western when you are in the lawless frontier when the person who's come there from the east, the greenhorn, you know, looks around and sort of says to, you know, like Henry Fonda in My Darling Clementine, in that corrupt town, he looks around and goes, "What kind of a place is this I've come to?" And so Phoebe is that. She's someone coming in that Jimmy Stewart role or Henry Fonda role to look at the chaos and insanity of the frontier and kind of grab them by the collar and shake them and say, you know, why do you think this is normal? Why do you think this is okay? And she's got a mission. She's looking for this lost, this runaway college kid,
Right.
Her friend's daughter who ran away, and that leads her into this this labyrinth of bizarre characters in the desert.
And so she meets this guy Charlie Heist, who is, there's something significant about the firstborn son of this group.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about Charlie.
Well, so he's the title character, the feral detective, and he's been kind of commended to Phoebe as someone who knows this landscape. And his shtick is that he will rescue people who've gone off the grid. He's kind of good at finding you if you don't want to be found. And so she, kind of enlists him for the search, and also becomes involved with him in various ways, and annoyed by him in various ways. She can't figure out what his deal is. And eventually he sort of confesses to her as they drive deeper into the desert that he was raised by these tribes. He was born unto the rabbits and bears, and comes out of that landscape directly, and so he actually sort of ran back towards civilization at some point. But the thing about Heist is that he's called the feral detective, but he's not a feral character in the sense that you would think of. He's like a failed Tarzan. He's not, doesn't embody all of the kind of superhuman sort of, or Mowgli, this sort of wonderful freedom and capacity that you associate with the feral character in fantastic literature, where they can kind of do what animals do, but also are totally functional humans. Instead, he's a kind of, he's almost like a Bartleby the Scrivener character who's just retreated from all of these situations. He would, he'd rather not be involved. He was elected, as you say, he was the firstborn, and he was sort of groomed to be the king of the bears, and he would prefer not to. So he's a very passive figure in many ways. Every now and then he delves into the old landscape and kind of pulls someone else out of the chaos, but otherwise he's very he's sort of frozen or inert, and that's part of what irritates Phoebe so much.
Yes. Well, I was going to ask you, in some ways, is he the feral detective? I mean, does Phoebe in some ways become the feral detective in a way?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of joke in the book about which one of them is conducting the investigation. And at first, it would seem like it's him, and she's stuck in the old female script of, sitting around waiting for the detective to call and say when he's found something, which she doesn't dig, and then he gets in trouble and she sort of has to take over.
Right. Is there also a riff in this book, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but is there a riff about kind of our, something is sort of awakened in Phoebe, and is there like a disconnect between our relationship with our physical world and our physical environment these days that
yeah,
I mean, kind of
I like that all of those implications that you're suggesting creep in. I mean, she's certainly she's reached a certain limit in the premises of her existence as a she grew up on the island of Manhattan, and her parents are both psychoanalysts. She goes to Harvard, and then she works for NPR. So she's, then she gets to work for the New York Times, and she's kind of run out the string on the particular
in a bubble of some sort.
Particular bubble of privilege and sophistication that carried her a long way. And I mean, it's not just about opportunity; it's also about worldview. I mean, she there's a point in the book where she realizes that she's borrowed a lot of her sensibility from her father's love of watching old, 30s romantic comedies on TCM.
Right.
But that actually that's not going to play anymore for her, even though she's affectionate towards it. It's sort of part of a evaporating world that isn't going to sustain her. So I don't know that she finds an answer. It isn't really a book that presents an answer, but there's the appetite for a next thing. I mean, in a way, she's just trying to throw herself out of these concealing descriptions and devices into a place where she can become apparent to herself, and what she might really need would be the next question.
Right. What's funny, just kind of growing up here in the Phoenix area, and my grandmother lived in Los Angeles. She actually was the little old lady from Pasadena, and so when I was growing up, we made countless trips across the desert, and that area you're talking about, like let's just say from Indio into Los Angeles, you pass Banning, Colton, Beaumont, all these fascinating little towns, Fontana, and there's a part in the book where you describe the surreal landscape of all those windmills, and it's just I don't know, it's just kind of creeps into your psyche. It's an interesting way to get, as you say, I think of Huck Finn lighting out for the territories, and going across the border, and then this just a stream of fascinating communities before you actually get to Los Angeles. Not really sure there's a question there, but just more of an observation. And Mount Baldy. Also, I was going to ask you about Mount Baldy.
It's the whole Inland Empire and the spaces before what you might call sort of the poster child desert. 29 Palms or Joshua Tree, but these indistinct zones. Riverside is another place that's it's a really strange combination of the West and in a way the Midwest, because what people did for security is build a very kind of normative, you know, suburban space there and try to just live. It's not about LA like you picture it in the movies, and it's not about anymore about the Wild West. It's about sort of just this troweled on middle American post-war civilization that's just everyone's kind of clapping to keep their belief going in it. You know, the people, you know, they bring the water in from elsewhere, and they just keep building it out, and but it's very opaque, I think, because it's precisely because it's so normative that you know it breeds madness. You know, it's the American William Cross Williams said the pure products of America go crazy. But yeah, so I also included Mount Baldy in the book, which looms over where I live now. It's right above Claremont, and Baldy is a great just place of you know, it's again, it's another thing you can drive to that's just anomalous and very different from what surrounds it, and has all kinds of weird legacies. It's the Zen monastery where Leonard Cohen did his retreat is up there. And it's where the speed of light was first measured, was on
really
top of Mount Baldy, and it's one of only 2 places in North America where you can mine lapis lazuli.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
So it's just a kind of a magic site, and people go up there again in different spirits of escape and defiance. You know, it's very unpoliced in a way.
So before we spoil too much of the book, it's fascinating. Read it, and you'll love it. But speaking of madness, you brought up madness. I'm fascinated by, and I know you are too. You know, you're one of the big champions of Philip K. Dick. But I was going to ask you about William Vollmann. Have you tried to tackle some of it, like the massive thing he wrote about the Imperial Valley? Have you?
I haven't. No, I'd be
into
interested
that?
to look at that. Yeah. No, I haven't read him in a while. I do like his first novel very much, and also not the 7-volume version, but that condensation of it, the 1-volume condensation of the history of violence.
Yeah.
But I never read that Imperial Valley book. His energy is titanic.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about Philip K. Dick. One of the things I forgot to mention too at the beginning, you know, Lethem is a wonderful novelist, but also as an essayist. You know, I've been reading your essays and your critical writings forever, and he has one of the best titles for an essay ever, in my opinion, which was on Philip K. Dick, and it was simply called "You Don't Know Dick." An essay about Philip K. Dick, which I thought was fantastic. And one of the things that I really admire about your whole approach is that you're into everything. You know, you mix what we would call lowbrow, you know, the pulp fiction, the classic, with the highbrow kind of arty European, more difficult stuff, and it all kind of comes together in your work. When did you first kind of discover Philip K. Dick's work?
Well, I think I stumbled across his writing when I was 13 or 14, and it was a book that was pretty new then. It was one of his 70s novels, one of his last novels, called A Scanner Darkly, that I read first, and I immediately just you know, I'd been reading, well, all sorts of things before that. Some of what I'd liked the most was kind of classic science fiction, you know, gateway drug science fiction, like Ray Bradbury, The Martian Chronicles, and Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, and I'd read some other science fiction writers and anthologies of short stories, and I think I'd gotten curious about Arthur C. Clarke because I'd seen 2001. So I was sort of scratching it, you know, maybe this is what I like. And then Philip K. Dick almost overwhelmed the whole category for me. You know, I did read a lot of other science fiction over the years and find other favorites, but he just became a very singular figure for me. And I was, part of what drove my investigations deeper into the genre was a constantly frustrated desire to find more like him, but there really wasn't anything else like his writing. and so it was strongly connected to my interest in American genre science fiction. But I also immediately connected him in my mind to other, I guess in some ways I want to say surrealist authors, most of whom were international, and I was finding them in translation, like Borges and Calvino, and Kafka even, and Cortázar, Stanislaw Lem, and I started to think of him as much connected in my own sensibility anyway, in my own reading, with that constellation of writers as I felt he really belonged with his tribe.
Walter Tevis.
Well, yeah, I loved Walter Tevis. Again, it was actually a film that led me to Walter Tevis. It was the Man Who Fell to Earth. But the books of Tevis I loved the most weren't Queen's Gambit and The Hustler. I mean, they're books about games, which became a very important kind of subgenre for me too. I mean, A Gambler's Anatomy was a book that comes out of my thinking about reading Tevis's books. There's the genres that you have sections for in bookstores, or you have a whole bookstore for, and those are often big and broad, but hiding inside the literary shelves in different places within the genres or within what's called the mainstream, or just contemporary fiction, or just classic literature, are other kinds of genres that don't have a library classification or a marketing category, like gambling, books about games of chance, which to me is a very interesting, fascinating subgenre, or the academic satire, which I've attempted at least one of, and I'm often much more interested in these slightly more localized genre identifications.
There's a novel, I'm sure you know it well, called Nightmare Alley by William Lindsay Gresham, which I think is one of the great American novels.
Yeah, really great.
It's one of those things it seems like it's about one thing, but it's one of the great, I think, the finest books about alcoholism, finest novels about alcoholism.
Yeah.
Anyway, we could geek out about this stuff, and I'm actually going to do a little podcast with Jonathan about neglected writers. So, but I just like to pick your brain on this stuff and see what you're into. Ian Rankin was just here. He was talking a lot about. I can talk to him about music and about obscurities and stuff, and he's kind of awakened a real interest in Muriel Spark.
I love Muriel Spark.
Yeah.
Or some of her early novels, Memento Mori and The Bachelors.
The Driver's Seat.
Yeah, that's a really great one. The Takeover, set in Italy. It's a book I really love.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to do a little show and tell here. I know you've done a lot of introductions and essays about Philip K. Dick. But then we get this thing, the exegesis of Philip K. Dick. Can you tell them which you had a hand in putting together in editing?
Yeah.
Tell me about this.
Well, if you haven't read about his life, it's a very anomalous thing and hard to explain. But in the last part of Dick's life, he was subject to a series of overwhelming and, by his testimony, totally involuntary religious visions or existential, cosmic, visionary episodes where he felt he was just being informed by some other power or presence.
Valis.
Informed about the nature of reality. And he basically, I think at times he felt that he was going crazy, and I think it's very easy for people to hear about this and put it in that framework from the outside. But as a writer, what he did was attempt to record this new understanding that had been awakened in him, and it was a process of attempts over a period of 7 or 8 years of trying to just basically capture the insight that he'd been granted, that was perplexing, and that he kept looking for different kind of language tools to give form to, and also it sent him on a frantic search for historical or religious or philosophical pre-existing philosophical or religious concepts that would fit what he felt he understood. And so he was doing this simultaneously, writing down everything that had come to mind, and he was researching, looking for points of comparison, and he was an extremely energetic and not to say compulsive researcher and writer, and so he generated, what are effectively just philosophical, speculative notes for a period of 7 or 8 years, and some of them are very on point and carefully worked out, and some of them have a manic frenzy to them where he's just trying to catch up to his own impression. They're all really fascinating to read, but it's quite a lot. And this compendium of them, which I edited together with my friend Pamela Jackson, out of his handwritten papers, because the majority of this stuff was done in his handwriting, which wasn't terrific. That's only a portion of those writings. I mean, there could be
for volume 2.
Oh, there would be more. There would be another. If it was the complete exegesis, it would be at least twice as big.
Good God.
But a lot of that did, of course, the excluded material basically represented repetitions or lesser recapitulations of similar ideas. But one of the fascinating things that he does is he began to, so if you're a novelist who's written at that point 35 or 40 novels, and they're pretty weird and interesting and full of ideas already, and then you receive, as if like a bolt of lightning has been thrown into your head, certainty that you have seen into the nature of the universe. One of the speculations, and I would say maybe under the circumstances a fairly reasonable one, was to think, oh, probably that's what I was writing about all the time. I just didn't know it. So he goes back and rereads his own work as research and decides to interpret his own science fiction novels as clues. Oh, I see. I was being given tiny fragments of insight before I was given the whole thing. And so if I look at my novels in this new framework, I can go back and look at a book I wrote in 1964 or 1957 and see that, oh yes, God was talking to me then too. I just didn't realize it yet, so let me go and reinterpret my own work. So it's also, very strangely, it's like a mammoth project of, it's as if a religious, philosophical scholar has gotten hold of Philip K. Dick's collected writings and decided to interpret them, except it's Philip K. Dick who's the one doing it.
Wow, unbelievable. Do you have I'm sure you do. Do you have favorites of his, vast oeuvre?
Sure, yeah, and unfavorites. I mean, he was writing very fast and sloppy books for most of his career, and so there's a lot of distinctions to be made, and I think it's easy to point to a few that nestle around at the top and would be a good place for people to start and are the most lasting examples, and then there's at least 8 or 10 that are you really have to be obsessed with a guy to care about them at all, because they're just patchwork.
Which ones would you suggest for a new reader to his work?
Well, I often get into a conversation with people depending on what kind of thing they like reading beforehand. For people who are interested in him because he's a great American novelist, but they are not into science fiction, or they don't think they would like science fiction, I would suggest The Man in the High Castle, or his last published novel, Transmigration of Timothy Archer, because those are novels that reach a reader who's accustomed to a more traditional idea of what literary quality would be like, rich characterization and
Flow My Tears.
Flow My Tears is a very interesting book, and I sometimes do introduce him with that one. A Scanner Darkly can also work that way for someone who's not a science fiction reader. If someone does like fantastic literature, and they just haven't discovered Philip K. Dick, I will throw them into a more surreal kind of deep end with something like Ubik or the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge. And if someone is, conversely, if someone's really into philosophy and or religion, there's a great novel to enter into his work with called Valis, which is a real grabber, but it's very top-heavy with philosophical stuff. So it might depend on what you like already.
Right. Well, let's open it up to some questions from you guys. I'm sure you have them. This is your opportunity. I was afraid of this.
In all the research that you did for this book, what were some things or a thing that you found particularly surprising or enjoyable?
You mean for Feral Detective?
For Feral Detective, yeah.
Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, learning about the history of intentional communities in the West and how how substantial that history is and how much it's been effaced, and also the extent to which it still continues in some ways, that to me was really extraordinary. You know, I mean, whole parts of what we take for granted as kind of, you know, static, middle class, you know, I mean, like a town or city called Anaheim, which we think of as being the sort of bland place where that baseball team plays, and it's your image of it is probably that it's a very white suburb, although actually Anaheim's a very Hispanic city now. But one wouldn't associate it, for example, with any kind of visionary or utopian project, but actually Anaheim was created as an intentional community and with an extremely pronounced, you know, deliberate kind of, they were setting up a version of a utopia there. And then it just got kind of smothered in... Symbolized by
Air Disney's...
Well, it had nothing to do with Disney. I mean, no, sincerely, it's a place that people were trying to invent a new way of living there. It was an experimental place. And, you know, right, we think of it as Disney or a baseball team or, you know, just part of the LA sprawl now. And those kinds of discoveries were really interesting to me. And then there was the physical, you know, the excuse to go into the desert a lot in a Jeep. That was cool. And, you know, play music and rock climb with people who were good enough at that I didn't feel like we were going to run out of water and die. So that research was good. You know, and of course, what I alluded to, the re-encounter, making contact with my own kind of, the DNA of my own prose in hard-boiled writing, realizing how much, that's how I really learned to write. That's how I straightened out my sentences, was by imitating Chandler and Ross MacDonald. You know, it's why my first published novel, you know, happened to be in that style. Because the book I'd written before that was unpublishably bad. You know, it's like I really did, in a way, go to hard-boiled prose to figure out how to write a sturdy enough sentence. So that was a nice kind of reconnection. And, you know, also, I sometimes think of my books as this flux. You know, I write a very male book, and then I get really starved for the presence of the feminine. And so writing in Phoebe's voice was one of those moments, just as when, you know, I'd written The Fortress of Solitude, which I'm very proud of, got a lot of characters in it. It was basically a fathers and sons book. And it was on the heels of Motherless Brooklyn, which is just like its title. It's a motherless book. It's fathers and sons, or orphans and adoptive fathers. And so I was like 5 or 6 years into fathers and sons, and then I was just dying for a woman in my writing space, you know. And so I wrote You Don't Love Me Yet, which was a kooky bass player in a band named Lucinda, who I was just really fond of, and it was a relief to be in her head instead. So that was another thing about this was, you know, it took a little courage, or just figuring out that in 2016, even at this era where people think very differently about appropriative issues, or, you know, writing the other, that I was going to do that. There was some hesitation or caution, but once I realized that I started to figure out who Phoebe was, and I really liked her, and I was going to get to hang out with her every day, that was cool, you know. So it's not exactly research, but preparing to do that and then deciding to do that was a real pleasure.
Sorry, I have word problems. Do you go like explore the places for like the settings of your book a lot? Like go around there and try to learn like the ins and outs too?
Yeah, I do go to places to write about them, and but it's not systematic, and I don't usually only go to a place because I've decided to write about it. Usually I'm already have a response to it, or I'm interested in it, or I've been in it, and then I intensify that commitment to the place once I decide to write about it. So, you know, like Joshua Tree and the Mojave, I was already kind of clicking with that area and realizing that it was meaning things to me, although I couldn't, it was inchoate. I didn't know what it meant to me, but I was feeling a lot of stuff about it, and I discovered some of the peculiar attractions out there in the desert, like the Integratron, which is this weird round building that you can go to and take sound baths in it. And then I conceived that I was going to write about it, and I was really excited because it was an excuse to go more and to go in a more focused way and spend more time and look for peculiarities. And you know, I did the same thing with Mount Baldy, which plays a smaller role in the book, but a very definite one. You know, I got some friends. I already thought it was a neat place, and I had one friend who lived up there, but I got him to introduce me to some of his most eccentric neighbors. You know, I confessed to him that I was going to write about it, and I had him just take me around and show me some of what he thought were the characteristic eccentric types in Baldy Village. So I do make that effort, yeah. But there's no way in which it's like systematized. It's just I feel around until I've got the kind of peculiar details that are going to enrich my book and make me feel authorized, make me feel like I know enough. And then I make a lot of stuff up about those places anyway. I invent new things. Thanks.
My favorite of your books is your second, Amnesia Moon.
Thank you.
And fascinating. I've read it a number of times. I'm going to understand it someday. Keep at it. What prompted you to write, or what influences brought it about? Do you remember?
Well, so I'm very sentimental about Amnesia Moon, and which isn't the same thing as being sure that it is worth reading many, many times and figuring out, because I also have a lot of insecurities about whether it makes enough sense. But I'll tell you some things about its origin and it'll make it clear why it's such a sentimental project for me. So, I mean, I kind of lied when I said that my first published novel is the hard-boiled one, Gun with Occasional Music, because actually there are parts of Amnesia Moon that were written before Gun with Occasional Music, and in some cases considerably before. There are portions of short stories I wrote when I was like 18 and 19 that made their way in some recognizable form into Amnesia Moon. But I didn't organize them into a novel until after I'd written Gun with Occasional Music. So I knew a little more, and I had a little more sense of structure. And then I took on this challenge, which was a really, maybe a questionable decision, but I decided that I wanted to write the next novel, after the very tightly structured Hard-Boiled Detectives novel, Gun with Occasional Music. I wanted to write a novel that was like Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, that started over and over again in different styles and different realities. And I also was thinking about Steve Erickson, who I was reading with great interest at that time, and the diffuse feeling about reality that you could get from reading a Steve Erickson book. And of course I was still also very much under the influence of Philip K. Dick, and I was thinking of some of his books where reality changes the most over and over again, like Eye in the Sky, where different portions are told by different subjective people who are changing reality as they think. And Ursula Le Guin wrote a beautiful book called The Lethem of Heaven, which was her homage to Philip K. Dick, which is another one of these books where reality changes in each chapter. So I thought, I'm going to write one of these, something between Calvino, The Lethem of Heaven, Steve Erickson, and the way I'm going to do it, and this is where it's really inadvisable, is I'm going to rope together a bunch of previously unrelated short stories that I wrote, including like some of the earliest ones I ever tried, and I'm going to redeem these unpublished short stories by turning them into different worlds within the world of Amnesia Moon. So, like, the second big section where they're in that place where there's the green fog that makes you blind, that was a short story that I wrote when I was 18 years old and sent out to, Isaac Asimov's, and got a rejection slip and just put it in a drawer, and then I pulled it back out and incorporated it into this novel. So So if you're having trouble, I'm sorry. But it's very dear to my heart because I worked really hard on making a system, at least for the period that I was writing the book, where all of these things did seem related in an intuitive or uncanny sense, and that they could add up to one
So
vision.
it's the exegesis of Jonathan Lethem.
Yeah, yeah.
I really enjoy reading it, so
Thank you.
I don't mind.
Good.
Well, then as she climbed across the table.
That became my third published novel, and that was a project conceived very differently, but it's in a sense earnestly a third novel in that it was started entirely after those first two, and at that point I was reading a lot of Don DeLillo, and particularly grooving to his two books on college campuses, M Zone and White Noise, and I also really loved an early book by John Barth called The End of the Road, which is a campus novel, but with a weird philosophical peculiarity to it. And I also wanted to write, with As She Climbed Across the Table, again I was thinking of Calvino, but also Stanislaw Lem. I wanted to write something where reality got very rubbery and cartoonish. So I was thinking of Stanislaw Lem in the mode of like the Futurological Congress, or Memoirs Found in a Bathtub, and I was putting all of those elements together. But the prose style was really different, because instead of leaning on the hard-boiled style, I was kind of shamelessly imitating John Barth and Don DeLillo in that draft. The first draft of that book.
The Hitler Studies.
Yes, right. Hitler Studies. That's from White Noise.
Right. And so after, let's just go through the kind of this is your life, greatest hits here. So after As She Climbed Across the Table was
Girl in Landscape.
Girl in Landscape. Yeah. What kind of informed that one?
Well, I was watching John Ford movies. I've already alluded to Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and The Searchers. The atmosphere of those and the problem of the John Wayne character. I wanted to plant a figure in the foreground who was, this is in a way that prefigures like the bears in Feral Detective. I was thinking about American masculinity in the West and the heroic abomination of this figure who's, both carves out space where civilization can maybe flourish, but is so violent that he's ill-qualified to be part of the civilization. And of course, historically, we can also associate this with a genocide, because it wasn't actually empty space that they were carving out into. And the attractiveness, the charisma, the provocativeness, and the abysmal nature of, because I grew up in a left-wing family. John Wayne was seen as a kind of joke, militaristic, macho asshole. He wasn't seen as an interesting figure. It was really snuck up on me when I watched those movies later, because I had to overthrow my idea that John Wayne was totally uninteresting, and accept that I was actually finding him very seductive and a rich figure, an upsetting figure for me to contemplate, because there was a destabilizing quality to the claim he made on my attention. And so I wanted to write about a figure like that.
Does B. Traven kind of go into your kind of...
Well, I didn't actually read B. Traven until much, much later, but the
seems like you'd be down with him.
Well, the film of The Treasure of Sierra Madre is very important to me. But I did like him later. I tried to teach him, but there are these long kind of lectures about communism that crop up.
Yeah.
If you it's almost like someone should go back and edit some of the speechifying out of B. Traven, and it would be a little bit better.
There's a wonderful nonfiction book that I recommend everybody called God's Middle Finger. Middle Finger. You know it?
I don't.
Anybody here read that book?
I've heard
You
of it.
have? Yeah. But it's a wonderful book about this British journalist who becomes, he wrote another novel, or a nonfiction book called American Nomads, where he spent
I remember
Richard
that
Grant.
one. Yeah, yeah.
But it's all about this guy. He becomes obsessed with the Sierra Madre and traveling through it on foot, You know, and of course everybody tells him you're insane, it's completely lawless, cartel, blah, blah, blah. But he does it anyway. And it's just a wonderful book. And along the way he talks about, you know, the crazy kind of history of, you know, German oddballs who kind of disappeared in there, and, you know, the mythic lost Apaches who never surrendered, and the Tarahumara Indians, and the cartel. I mean, it's got something for everybody, you know. But it's kind of in line with some of what you're talking about in California, this sort of, you know, mythic sort of place. Check it out. Yeah, great book. Anybody else?
What are you reading right now?
Well, I am on book tour, and it's not a great time for reading, but I did just give a blurb to it, this remarkable first novel from Australia that really knocked me out, called The Town by Sean Prescott, and it's a kind of a ontological mystery or noir set in Australia at a time when it's kind of vaguely post-apocalyptic. It actually has some of the air of the Steve Erickson books that I was revering and wanting to imitate when I wrote Amnesia Moon, or maybe something like one of those very early Paul Auster books as well. Very spare and dry and funny, and just really intriguing. And it feels somehow like he's updated that kind of post-apocalyptic image for a very contemporary. I mean, it feels also like it's a book about the death of cities and gentrification, but all done in a very indirect and unpretentious way. Really neat book. So that's one.
What's your feel about some of the new generation, like China Mieville and Paolo Bacigalupi?
I read The Town and the Town, which I thought was really great. I haven't read other China Mieville books yet. But I don't say the other name.
Paolo Bacigalupi. Am I saying that correctly?
I don't know who that is.
Yes.
Get out of town, really? Or Richard Morgan, Altered Carbon.
Oh, I've seen that title, but I have not read that yet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jeff Vandermeer?
Yeah, I like Jeff Vandermeer. Of that trilogy, I have to say I thought the first one was the perfect book, and then I wasn't as persuaded by what he did with the next couple. But sometimes I feel that way about a lot of trilogies, actually. Like, actually, the first book is the...
But sometimes, when you just have this one experience,
Yeah.
and then...
Yeah. I feel that way about The Wizard of Earthsea, too, that ultimately it's actually just one amazingly perfect book. I want to read more Vandermeer than I have.
I really liked Bourne a lot.
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
I thought that I had some real problems with acceptance, and some of the but I thought Bourne sort of did kind of what they were trying to do, but better. Like, you thought he sort of fixed.
It's good. It's
Some of the
nice when we
weakness.
can start to fix the stupid things. I'm trying that all the time.
Got a couple more questions. I know Joe.
Yeah, so as someone who loves music, what are some of your favorite books about music?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot that I love, and and I've worn some of these names on my sleeve. I still read whatever Greer Marcus writes, and actually I think one of his most recent ones, he's so fast that it's probably 2 or 3 books old, but the History of Rock and Roll in 10 Songs is one of the best things he ever did. Great book. So it's really exciting when someone who's been at it for 50 years, can still, for me, to still feel like, oh wait, that's, I have all sorts of different favorite books about music. I like, there's a biography of Elvis's mom by Elaine Dundee, the novelist who wrote The Dud Avocado. And it's out of print, but somebody should bring it back into print. It's an incredible book. I don't know where to begin.
Do you like the Peter Guralnick books?
Guralnick's Sam Cooke biography is superb. Yeah, I think I love that one even more. Maybe I just was
Elvis.
bored with the Elvis story because I picked up too much of it already. The Sam Cooke book. That sounds wrong. But the bio of Cooke was unbelievable. And then there are really good novels. I mean, everyone's always saying that rock novel is sort of a failed genre or like a trap, and they'll cite examples like Great Jones Street by DeLillo and say it's his worst book, or that You Don't Love Me Yet is my worst book, or something. And therefore, everyone should stay away from rock and roll. Which maybe that's good advice, but there are some really great ones too. Lou Shiner has a book called Say Goodbye that I love. Beautiful novel about a kind of a Lucinda Williams-ish folk rock talent.
Who wrote that book? Was it called Buddy Holly is Alive and Well in Ganymede?
I don't know that.
It's an odd one. I just read it. Speaking of great rock memoirs, there have been a lot of good ones in the last few years.
Yeah.
I just read Wayne Kramer's book about the MC5 and his own story.
I haven't read that yet, but I just got hold of one I'm excited to read. Chris Stamey from the DBs wrote a memoir.
Is that Brian Holsapple?
That's the other.
Peter Holsapple.
Peter Holsapple's the other guy. Chris Stamey is one, and I don't think Holsapple's written his.
No,
book
his
yet.
memoirs. Yeah. This gentleman over here.
I think you might have mentioned this before, but you said that Raymond Chandler was kind of a big influence on you. I'm actually in the middle of The Big Sleep. It's my first kind of introduction to Chandler, and I was kind of wondering, like, what his overall body of work has done to influence your...
Well, Chandler is one of those influences that came over me so early that it's like in my DNA, and I can express a lot of things about what it means to me without feeling like I can even get outside of it. Like Patricia Highsmith and Kafka and Philip K. Dick. It just helped organize my brain. And Chandler, when I look at him now, I mean, I think he's a really he's sort of flying by the seat of your pants writer, compared to someone like Ross Macdonald, who's very diligent and systematic. Macdonald turns the hard-boiled detective story into a kind of sonnet form where you can really feel the rhythm of the pattern and how much power that pattern holds. Chandler, who helped invent this, seemed to be doing it without understanding what he was doing a lot of the time, or just like a person who's walking down the street and they're falling, but they never fall down. They just always, it just turns into this incredible recovery and dance move. But at the time, the velocity of his stories and and just his emotional commitment and also that fundamental standpoint of the hard-boiled voice, which Hammett was an inventor of it as well, but I feel like Chandler actually invented the part of it that did more for me and meant more to me, which is the crushed romanticism. Because Chandler's really a disappointed romantic, and the books are suffused with this feeling. So,
have you read his letters?
Yeah, I love his letters.
Oh,
I like almost all the sort of stuff that comes to light. His notebooks and letters, and
he just kind of bleeds all over the page in those letters.
But he's not a good person to go to ultimately to understand how to structure a story, because I don't think he really did it except by intuition and
his prose is really good, but
luck.
I can't for the life of me figure out what's going on
Yeah.
in the story.
Well, he had that rule that he would quote, which is anytime you don't know what to do next in your story, just have a man walk through the door with a gun in his hand, and you can actually see him, writing with this principle.
I love the story about when Faulkner and Lee Brackett were writing the screenplay for The Big Sleep with Bogart, and they were involved in making the movie while it was going on. And at one point, they couldn't figure out who killed a certain character.
The chauffeur, yeah.
And they telegraphed Chandler and said, "Who killed the chauffeur?" And he said, "I have no idea."
Yeah, they go into that in the annotated.
The annotated Big Sleep captures that whole problem from a number of different perspectives, and then there's a couple of pages that basically solve it, that figure out
Right.
what Chandler couldn't figure out, which is who killed the shooter.
Jim?
You had a question?
When we see California now on the news, it's going up in flames and people are missing and all that sort of thing. Do incidents like that give you ideas or inspire you or new stories?
Well, I mean, one thing, just this is slightly oblique to your question, but one of Ross MacDonald's great late novels is set at a time when there's fires everywhere, called The Underground Man. And, you know, the entire landscape is burning while he's solving this crime and moving around through it, and they keep having to suddenly move away from an area, and it's just an incredible picture. He had a real, he was really prescient at writing with the hard-boiled detective form, but writing about kind of eco-catastrophe. It sneaks into that book, and also there's another one where there's an oil spill, and people are sort of
seabirds are
like
called.
wiping off ducks in the background of all these different scenes and stuff. Well, yeah, I mean the whole apocalyptic possibility out there, you know, whether it's actually occurring, like a water crisis that we've been living through for a decade out there, and which is connected to these fires, of course, or you know, or just the constant intimation that the earthquake will come and half of the city will fall into the sea. It's a big part of the mythic idea of, you know, what the price of living in paradise is, and you know, or that there's a hubris in going into this space in the first place. So it feeds into lots of what I think about and write about, which is the juncture of, you know, utopian desire to make the world new, and what the costs or the actual outcomes are about. Yeah.
It's funny, that book I was telling you about by Robin Robertson, Scottish poet, who has this new book out called The Long Take. He talks about, you know, once the freeway interpasses hit Los Angeles and what a game changer that was, you know, and the destruction of the old city, and et cetera. But make a note of that. Jim's in a book group that we've been doing for about, I don't know, 17 years, something like that. All about noir and hard-boiled literature. We haven't done The Underground Man yet, so it'd be a good time. Any final questions, or?
It sounds like your research and your site visits and your influences have all helped you conceive of the surrounding environment of where you live in a pretty mythic and epic way. How has that process impacted, given that you live in the midst of that, how has that impacted your everyday conception of where you live?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, one thing is, you know, this book is about kind of getting in a car or a Jeep and going out into it, but it's also made me really feel the sense in which I'm actually enmeshed in it. You know, I wake up and I walk a block and I'm in a space that has some of this kind of, I mean, it's not all epic. Some of it's very, you know, some of it's doesn't have a drama to it, but it's just distinct, and it seems to me laden with meaning or mystery or potential. I live, you know, one early sequence in this book is set in a thing called the Wash, which is a real thing that I live right next to, and that everyone I live around lives next to, but very few people ever look at it or know that it's there, even though it's 800 football fields large, which sounds like, how could you not notice it? But people just drive right past it and around it without questioning what it's there for. Well, it has a historical purpose, which is, it's called, the full name is the Mount San Antonio Wash. Mount San Antonio turns out to be the real name of what people call Mount Baldy. And because of the possibility, historically, that a very large snowpack could melt all at once during a big rainstorm, the entire valley I live in can and has flooded. And so they left this basically vast geological drain basin in the middle of the Inland Empire. So there's suburbs all around it, and there's this giant rocky gully. It's like the arroyo of the gods, but it doesn't look like anything to anyone. And so no one thinks about it. It's fenced, and it's placed for the water to go instead of destroying all of our homes. And it's just hiding in plain sight. And what's more, and I wrote about this a little bit in the book, homeless people live in it, because of course they do. And so 99% of the time living in the wash means that they have little pup tents down in the bottom of this unbelievably vast dry arroyo, and they go unnoticed. But homeless advocates know that if there is a big enough rain, that actually one of the jobs is to run down there and save the people who are living in what is essentially our giant geological drain pipe, that they have to be rousted out, because they won't understand that where they are is actually going to be like 30 feet underwater. It could be in the space of 2 hours of rainfall, because the entire environment has been designed to drain to that spot. So they've probably selected the very bottom because it's the most hidden and protected place. So that's fascinating, and I'm just seeing my space, both in terms of where people are living that you wouldn't think about, and what people are living beside that they don't think about. It actually reminds me a lot of the Fortress of Solitude when Brooklyn was gentrifying, and yet it was so incomplete, it was so incoherent, in terms of the lives of the people living in Brooklyn and how they were affected differently or not affected. And I remember when that book came out, and I would get these very smug interviewers who would come and walk with me down Smith Street, and we'd be near all these French restaurants, and they'd be like, it's so hard to believe you were ever afraid walking down Smith Street. It's so bougie here now. And I would just say, let's go a block. And I would walk them 1 block of city distance into the projects where I would feel their physical resistance. And I would say, let's cross in, and we'd walk into the project. And in their mind, there was a kind of pre-conscious psychic boundary that said, that no longer exists. Hoyt Street, the housing projects, places I would be afraid of in my own urban space, don't exist. I'm just going to stay on Court Street and Smith Street and not even know that that's there. And so there's the coexistence of different realities, But also the wash is being gentrified because they've now, first of all, they're gambling, mostly correctly, that the rainfall will never and the snowpack will never be what they once were. And because they've built some diversionary underground hydraulics for the runoff, they're now chopping out parts of the wash and turning them into these tract homes. So the book is already becoming a historical book because that 800 football fields, suddenly the developers were like, let's go for it, we don't need the wash anymore. We'll see how that works out.
They're turning them into tract homes?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Wow. There's something poetic about that. Float away when the rains come. One last question.
Yes, I'll be the last. The best book that I have read by you is Chronic City.
Oh, thank you.
It has had such an impact on my own writing, my own thinking, and then I have a copy of the Paris Review book of short stories where you did the introduction to, I can't remember whose story it was.
Harkus Tooth.
Yeah, about the artist.
Yes.
I don't care about that story.
Oh, I know.
But
Thomas Glynn's story. Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I keep rereading your
really?
introduction. I'm serious.
Oh,
I mean, it is.
That's nice.
Great writing.
Chronic City is, I think, my favorite of my books
good.
on most days.
On most days.
Or anyway, it's my favorite in that sense that it's not the one that most people name. I mean, I'm very proud of Mo's Brooklyn and the Fortress of Solitude as well. And,
yeah.
But I feel I did something that I still look at Chronic City and I'm like, where exactly did that come from? Could I ever do that again?
Well, I hope so.
Actually, the book I'm writing next, the book I'm about a third of the way into, feels to me connected to Chronic City in some ways. It's almost like a rustic Chronic City, a rural Chronic City, which doesn't sound like it makes any sense at all, but set in Maine.
I have to tell you, when I first started it, it starts in such a weird way.
Yeah.
And I sent an email to my sister in Maryland. I'm here in Arizona. and I said, I just started reading this book. I don't know. This guy looks like it's gonna be crazy. I don't know if I can handle it. But it ended up being one of my favorites.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled.
Thank you.
Well, let's all give Jonathan a nice